kind of sloppy. Good morning. Got to play guitar last night with real musicians. It was a humbling experience. I like to think of what I do with the guitar as being a like unto Horace, in the sense that I'm using the guitar as a lyre, L-Y-R-E, not L-I-A-R, as a lyre to create a kind of lyric poetry with my speech to accompany myself. But it's much too easy to see the difference between that and real music in the presence of the real things. I am chagrined. I am humbled. And yet I'm inspired to do better, and this is the benefit of playing basketball with the big kids as you get better. I have been thinking about a story. I don't know if I'll write it or not. The easiest thing in the world to do is to start writing a book, and the hardest thing in the world to do is to finish writing a book. I speak from the experience of having written, I don't know how many books, more than 10, I believe. Having started perhaps more than 50. In any case, I've been thinking about a story, and I don't know that I'll write it as a book. There are things that I really like about it and things that I really don't like about it. The things that I don't like about it may win out in the end, but one of the things that I realized about this story is somewhere well into it, maybe 2, 3, 4 books into it, the protagonist, the hero, the central character, is going to end up declaring himself to be a rational oligarch. Short out some circuits in your brain if you try to work at rational oligarch. We are trained to believe that the word rationality is some kind of gold standard imprimatur of intellectual quality, whereas what rationality actually means is proportionality. To reason rationally is to reason in proportion with the facts. And so the point of this is that I could easily contrive an extreme circumstance, an outlier circumstance, and that's what we're talking about, is sort of a dystopian future history comedy, which is a nice little mashup that may get me to write these books just because the mashup is so absurd to me. But it is plausible to argue that in certain extreme circumstances, the absolute best thing that an individual person can do is to assert oligarchical authority over his immediate neighbors in order to protect them all. And that's the nature of this particular part of the story. That's the reason that he does it. It is the argument of Cincinnatus. The town in Cincinnati is named after Cincinnatus. We say Cincinnatus and Cincinnatus. I don't even know how you say it in everyday English, but Cincinnatus was a Roman general, a very successful Roman general who had retired and was plowing his own farmland. He was tending to his own lands when the Roman Republic found itself in an emergency that required immediate, decisive action. And this is the argument of the dictator in Roman politics going back forever in the Roman Republic, is that the Romans recognized that the Republican form of government, whatever its virtues, was relatively slow, substantially faster than what we have today, but still relatively slow, and incapable of taking that kind of quick, decisive, mission-critical action necessary, for instance, to survive an invasion, which is what Cincinnatus was up against. And so they came to him and they said, you must set down your plow and become our dictator, come and execute this war. And that's what he did. And at the end of it, what did he do? He laid down his arms and went back to his plow. And this is why we know the story of Cincinnatus. This is why it's important to us. It was important in Roman political discourse, and it's important to us by way of George Washington, who basically did the same thing, who first laid down his arms as a general and became a civilian politician, and then after he had served as president for 2 terms, voluntarily forbore to pursue more political power, and instead wrote a wonderful farewell address. Government as a servant, master, government is fire. It'll destroy everything eventually. It was very prescient. It was really full of good advice that everyone in the United States ignored. But that idea of a rational oligarch is a really nice way of pointing out the proportionality of rationality that in extreme circumstances, and I'm not arguing for oligarchy, obviously, but in extreme circumstances it can make sense. The other part of the story that is most interesting to me is the hoplite idea that I've been playing with. I wrote about it on Monday, I wrote about it again on Wednesday. It's basically writing about the thinking that is going into these stories. I like dealing with day-to-day news and political stories and things like that. I like dealing with them as fiction. I like to turn them into fiction. Kind of, it's what I do, but it's also a very good way for me to understand what's going on. That if I saw the same pattern, if I crafted, if I created, if I invented the same pattern of events, what would it mean and what would happen next? And that's not necessarily correspondent to reality, but it's interesting. It can be very informative about what's really going on in the world, and even if it's not, it's a nice way of drawing your mind back to practical ontology. It's utterly necessary whenever you make any sort of proposition, a statement in father tongue, it's utterly necessary to carry that statement back to the object. This is the idea of existentiality that I talk about all the time. The trouble with the idea of rationality as being some kind of gold standard, perfect methodology, is that it much too easily leads to rationalism, the idea that statements about statements are in some way dispositive, that drawing better and better detailed maps is in some way dispositive in reality, that if the map is not correspondent to reality, it's reality that's defective. This is an error, and this is the error of rationalism. This is the error that you lead yourself into when you rely too much on deductive propositions and do not persistently carry your deductive propositions back to the object, back to reality, back to existential reality, back to the way things really work. And so I've been hammering on the point that civilization is fatherhood, that the family is the building block of civilization, that without that freehold of land, that farm, that homestead, without that father, that mother, those children, without that chattel property, without all of these things that Dad is working constantly, consistently to build, maintain, sustain, and defend, without those things, there is no civilization, because there is no reason for Dad to fight for it. That hoplite civilization rose because government failed completely, disappeared. The hoplites, all of the Greeks in the Hellas, were living in that dreaded condition of anarchy where no super gangster with a great big gun is pointing his gun at people and saying, either do it or I'll kill you. There was nobody like that. These people lived in that anarchic condition for a long time, for maybe 400 years, but for a long, long time, and they got used to it. They came to understand the universe that way, that this is the way that children prosper, this is the way that families prosper, this is the way that farms get richer, this is the way that human beings can coexist with one another with a minimum amount of conflict and a maximum amount of cooperation. This is the invention of civilization. Not to say that there wasn't cooperation before then, but there was less cooperation and more conflict and more coercion and more compulsion and more unnecessary death and extreme outrageous tragedy and injustice. And by injustice, I mean actual injury to real innocent people who had done nothing to deserve that injury. It was more common before the Greeks. It's not uncommon now. It never will be uncommon. It is in the nature of reality that injustice will occur. Intentional injustice will occur, but even if it doesn't, lightning strikes, rats eat your seed stock, moths eat your sweater, mosquitoes bite you on the arm. All of these things can happen, and they will continue to happen. They are beyond correction by man, but what is amenable to correction by human beings is the tragedies that we inflict upon each other. And that hoplite situation, hoplite civilization, was a better means of achieving that end, a better means of achieving peaceful, conflict-free cooperation among neighbors. And the reason that they lived with a minimum of conflict and a maximum amount of cooperation is because they were all supremely well defended. They were defended by a father. And it was the father defending his home, his land, his family, his rights, his privileges, his prerogatives, his weapons, his arsenal. That father defending everything that was his against mosquitoes, against rats, against lightning strikes, against bandits, against organized brigands, and against governments, would-be autarchs. Him defending what was his against all enemies, against all perils. This is what resulted in human civilization. Western civilization is the product of fatherhood. I play with verbs all the time. I love verbs. I love all words. I like adjectives a lot. I really like adverbs. But I really love verbs because verbs are how we live. To be is to do, being is doing, and doing is done with verbs. Verbs are how we describe what we do, but they're also how we do it. It's not actual magic, it's kind of a sympathetic magic, but it works, that those verbs really push us. In the course of writing Father's Day, I rehabilitated the verbs husband and wife. To husband is to cultivate. That literally is what it means. We tend to associate husbandry with finance, and therefore husbandry in the context of finance implies kind of a chintzy, pecuniarious, greedy, chiseling avariciousness, a hoarding of cash. But that's not what husbandry is. Husbandry is cultivating fields, raising animals, raising children. Cultivating is cultivating yourself. Husbandry is cultivating yourself. I love that verb, to husband, and I love it in that context, to view it that way, that husbandry is cultivation. To wive meant something entirely different. So to wive, practically, when I came at last to wive with a hey-ho from Shakespeare, to wive in that context, what it literally means is that her father gives her to you, or you take her as a man. I wive myself by snatching onto this woman and never letting her go. But when I came at last to wive almost implies a gerundio state. To wive is not a present active indicative action. I am going down to church to wive myself. No, I have been wived. I am well and truly wived. My wivenness is now complete. We think about what might be meant by to wive in that circumstance. A lot of men might choose to be girlfriended instead, and the ideal circumstance might be to be mistressed. But I don't like any of those verbs that way. I don't like to wive that way. I like to think of the idea of wifery as meaning nurturance. That to wive is to nurture, to husband is to cultivate, and to wive is to nurture. And it's interesting to look at those two verbs and to consider those two verbs in the context of the sex roles that are ubiquitous in monogamous romantic relationships in marriage, because this is what he does. He cultivates, he prepares the ground, he plows the ground, he plants the seeds, he harvests the seeds. But in the meantime, she's the one who's tending to and nurturing to, providing nurturance to their offspring, the plants that they're growing in their garden are their children. And he prepares and cultivates that garden, and she nurtures it. And the two of them working together get the job done, but they're two different jobs. And the job that he's doing is absolutely essential. That the job that she's doing cannot be done without him first doing the act of cultivation. There's no way that you can nurture plants that were not planted. There's no way that you can tend to fields that were not plowed. There's no way you can raise children if you were not first inseminated. There's no way you can raise those children if they are killed by bandits or brigands or tax collectors. So the father is absolutely essential to that freehold, to that hoplite freehold, and he's absolutely essential to human civilization now. We're just not aware of it because we have so much luxury and so much wealth that we can get by for now with a lot of fatherless households, a lot of homes where children are being raised without fathers. These children are not well raised, and they do not do as well as they could have and should have done had they been well raised. But we have enough well-fathered homes, and we have enough wealth created by the fathers in well-fathered homes that we can suffer quite a bit of otherwise marginal behavior. In other words, behavior at the margins that will be cut off quickest, soonest, earliest, if ever those margins narrow. And that's the point of the story, Youngtown, is that the margins narrow, and the father's role becomes that much more important because there is no safety net, no cushion, no alternative to a father-led home. That's why the story is interesting to me. But because of the idea of rational oligarchy, etc., one of the things that I want to play with all the way through is what we might call the liberating bondage of the hug. The hug is an interesting gesture because it's mutually bonding. We're bonding. We're bonding. What does bonding mean? Bonding means bondage. Bonding means ropes and chains. We are bound to each other. We are bonded. But when you hug someone, you're putting your arms around her, she's putting her arms around you, and if you're really hugging, then you're going to hold for a while, 10 seconds, 20 seconds, maybe longer. You're going to hold each other. You are literally bound to each other. You are bound by your arms. They're not ropes, and they're not difficult to escape, assuming that nobody is really trying to prevent escape. But nevertheless, you are symbolically expressing your bondage to each other by literally binding your bodies to each other. I love that kind of poetry, and it makes perfect sense. You watch for this kind of poetry. This is one of the reasons why you want to continually carry your ideas back to the object, because when you do, the object will be so informative that comparing the way that men behave in their families with the way that women behave in their families, and then talking about the ideas of cultivation and nurturance, make it very plain what it is that's going on. And then when you understand that penetration, the word penetration means to be poked by a penis. That's what it means, to have a penis stuck into you. You have been penetrated. And without that penetrative act, there is no child, there is no family, there is nobody to be nurtured because no cultivation has taken place. Without that bondage expressed by the hug, there is no family, and without that family, there is no civilization, and without that civilization, there is no liberty. Liberty is created by the bondage of the hug. Liberty is created by all sorts of mutually binding actions that people who love each other storgically, who love each other with the enduring love of families, they express their bondage to each other in all sorts of different ways, but it is that bondage to each other that creates the liberty that each one of those people knows outside of the household. So you can say that within the household, they are not perfectly politically free in the sense that Dad has a whole lot of political prerogatives that other people don't have. He also has a whole lot of responsibilities that other people in the family don't have. Same for Mom. Certain rights, privileges, responsibilities, duties. Each one of the children, same thing. I mean, it's all different for each person, but Dad is preeminent, Mom is first among equals, and everybody else is going along because that's the way it's going to be. And as much as we want to talk about the liberating bondage of a hug, the liberating bondage of a hug is really only possible to fully knowledgeable, fully consenting volunteers, which population cannot possibly include the children. Didn't volunteer to be conceived, didn't volunteer to be gestated in the womb, certainly didn't volunteer to be born. What an amazingly traumatic experience to be something the size of a watermelon ejected through an orifice that is charitably the size of a grapefruit at its biggest. It's gotta hurt. Their skulls get crushed on the way out. They're born pointy-headed because their skulls are built to be crushed on the way out. Crushed! You know, talk about a coercive act. There is no more coercive act than pushing of a baby out of a womb. My God. If you were in a car accident, this happened to me. If you were in a car accident and the car is smashed up so badly that they have to use the jaws of life to pull you out, you could argue that this is a liberating coercion in the sense that you are substantially imprisoned already, and as damaging as your rescue might be, it is certainly preferable to remaining where you are. This cannot be the case for a baby. That Mom might want it out, Mom's body might want it out. The baby is certainly growing too big for its environment. We would hate to see it crack out of the womb like a baby quail cracking out of its shell. But it cannot possibly be the case that the infant wants, is anticipating, is hoping for, is posting little notes on Facebook about its great anticipation for the forthcoming event, at which point it will be extruded through a tiny little hole over the course of 30 hours. And then delivered into a vastly overlit, freezing place, covered in mucus and bile, and jostled this way, jostled that way, held upside down, maybe spanked on the ass, thrown on Mama's lap, embraced in her liberating hug, whether you like it or not. And thus is just the beginning of your indignities. There's no such thing as a non-coercive diaper change. If you have ever changed an infant's clothes, if you've ever put a onesie on an infant, you have discovered just exactly how willing you are to use physical compulsion to achieve your goals. And yet, this is a liberating process for that child in the long run. It's a very long run. But the only way to be a free and self-responsible, self-conscious, self-adoring adult human being is to go through all of these coercive processes from the point of conception until forever, really, but at least until you graduate high school or college. Parents are going to be pushing you around. You're going to be doing it for your own good, they say, and almost always that's true. But they're going to be pushing you around, and in a lot more ways than you're aware of, a lot more ways than you're going to be aware of until you're a parent yourself, and you find yourself saying, hey, let's hit the road, toads, like that, with a whole lot of enthusiasm and a joke. Because if you don't do something to motivate those kids, they will never get in the car, and you will never get where you're going. And so you hustle them. It's suasion. It's not quite fraud, but it definitely is suasion. It is the assertion of my priorities as the highest priorities, and my willingness to engage in all kinds of subtle, underhanded, suasive devices, not persuasive, not valid, but semi-invalid, close to invalid, definitely more enthusiasm than intellectual rigor, and using all kinds of little tricks like that to get children to do what they otherwise would not do, and yet they need to do in order to achieve their goals, not your goals, but their goals. You are setting them up, you're trying to launch them into the best possible orbit, and the idea of launching a child is unbelievably coercive. I love the poetry of it. You want to launch your child into the best possible orbit, but to launch your child means to throw him. What can be more coercive than that? The family that you're born into, I always talk about the water you swim in. It's very difficult to communicate to people about things that are so common to them that they don't notice them, that fish do not notice the water they swim in. How could they? It's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. It's completely normal. The water that you swim in when you're a child is a fishbowl. You don't know it. Your family is a fishbowl, and you think it's representative of everything. You think when you're growing up that the way that you do things at your house is the way that everybody does things at every house. It's an enlightening experience for a young child to visit his friends, to visit their families, to visit his cousins or his grandparents, or just to visit around and see that people do things differently. Because children never suspect that. Not originally. They can't. Why would they? Why would there be any alternative to this? This is all there ever was. Why would there be any alternative to this? So the water you swim in, while it seems to be everything that ever could possibly be, nevertheless it really is just a fishbowl. And every fishbowl is different. Every family is different. Every household is different. Maybe only subtly different. Maybe there's a whole lot of commonality. If you're a Norwegian living in suburban St. Paul, all of your neighbors may be an awful lot like you, and their families may be an awful lot like yours, and there may not be any huge differences you can note. There will be a lot of subtle differences. But if you are an expat American living in Tunis, Tunisia, I have a friend in Tunis, Tunisia. I can't imagine what it would be like to be an expat in Tunis, but everything is going to be different. You will have left the fishbowl of your family, of your community, of your country, of your expectations, and transfer to a completely different fishbowl, and then you will notice all of the differences. Every fishbowl is different. Almost none of them are wrong. Every family has a different way of doing things, and some will be more coercive, some less coercive. Some more honest, some less honest, some more transparent, some more opaque. Unless there is, serious ongoing physical or sexual abuse, emotional abuse in that family, the kids are going to turn out okay anyway. They might not be perfect, and they might not be launched into the best orbit they might have achieved, but they will make it into orbit. They'll make it on their own. They'll be able to move out. They'll be able to get jobs. They'll be able to drive a car. They'll be able to go to the supermarket and buy appropriate food and come home and prepare it. They'll be able to manage their finances. They'll be able to save money, one may hope. This may be an American virtue completely lost, but a fishbowl has to be pretty toxic for it to be wrong, in the sense that the children will emerge as adults and will manage their adult lives with a reasonable proficiency, and no one will have any good cause to complain about their upbringing. It's a global curse. Certainly it's definitely a curse of the West, kissing and moaning about all the things that your parents could have and should have done, or did and didn't do. And their job is to keep you alive until you're able to keep yourself alive. And if they did that, they did the job. Everything they did on top of that is gravy. If they miss that mark, there's no way we're having this conversation. You are not competent to exist. You're not even in the game. And the fact that almost everybody is in the game tells us that almost every fishbowl is fine. That a fishbowl that is so toxic that it results in an incompetent adult, a genetic Homo sapiens who is an adult by age but is really still an infant in its behavior, is completely incapable of defending its own life, providing for itself, living an autonomous existence. That kind of toxic fishbowl is unbelievably rare. This is the outlier among outliers. This is the weirdest thing in the world, the rarest thing in the world. And therefore it's not hugely beneficial to even consider it, to even think about it, But it's worse to blow minor things out of proportion in order to justify irrational actions. Again, remember, rationality is proportionality. And if your parents made mistakes, dang. If a mosquito bit you, dang. In both cases, get over it. There's nothing that you're going to do that is going to undo what was done in the past, but there's a lot that you can do that will result in genuine tragedy for you and for your family in the future. And I think it's important, utterly, vitally important, to understand that storgic relationships are non-fungible. That friendship is largely fungible. Having a job or joining a club or a community, these are fungible events. That if you have a new friend and it doesn't work out, you lost a couple of weeks, you have a new friend, another new friend. If you take a position on a committee and then realize that you cannot stand sitting through those boring meetings, you submit your resignation and you move on. It doesn't mean anything. But if you have a lifelong friend, a friendship that has really meant the world to you over the years, this cannot be replaced. The friendship can break apart. It can happen. But you cannot get a substitute for that will substitute for what you had before. It cannot happen because the time is gone. You spent this time with that person. The events that you lived through cannot be replicated. They can't be replaced. And the time that transpired over the years while those events were taking place cannot be replaced either. You can make a new friendship. It can be a great friendship. It may be a better friendship than the one you had. But you will not replace the values that you lost when you broke that earlier friendship, because the past cannot be repeated. This really matters to me in the context of, I guess, church business. I'm really careful about this. I do not want to interfere with anything that you have going that's working for you. It's one of the reasons that I don't pick on religion all that much. I don't have any respect for religion. I don't believe in anything supernatural, whatever, but I'm not going to pick at your religion, because if it's working, make it work. And if it's not working, you'll figure that out and you can do what you need to about it. I don't want to take it away from you. I don't want to take your family relationships away from you. I certainly don't want to take your marriage or your children away from you. This is the worst thing that anyone could possibly do, would be to intervene in a family that is not toxic, that is not, there is no ongoing physical sexual abuse, and to intervene in that family in such a way that you break it up. This is called divorce counseling. A lot of divorced women do it. They encourage their still married friends to break up their marriage so they can all be divorced antique single mother harpies together. But I bring all this up in the context of Swann, who twice this week people have brought him up to me, and I don't intend to make any kind of comprehensive claims about Swann because I really don't know anything about him, and I don't intend to find out. My impression of him is that he's an entertainer, that he's basically a stand-up comic who wastes a lot of time on video, and I don't have it. I know that I'm wasting your time right now. I do recognize that. That is exactly what I'm doing, is I'm wasting your time. I'm maximizing my time by going through things that I would not cover. I can do in 30 or 50 minutes what would take me half a day or longer to do in an essay, and I'm not going to do it, and therefore I take things that I'm not going to write about and discuss them here. And if you watch them now in 2014 when I made this, that's great, and my expectation is that almost nobody will watch them now. So that expectation is borne out so far. But I'm not talking to people who are watching me now. I'm talking to people who are watching me later, and I expect that there will be quite a few people watching these videos later, because they'll be the only ongoing source of new things for me. After you've read everything I've written, you're going to watch everything that I made in video, because that's how you're going to learn what I taught. A lot of the teaching that I'm doing in video, because it's the only way that I'm going to get it done. And I don't have that impression of Molyneux. To the contrary, I think that he's punching out a whole lot of video to occupy people's time, to waste their time, to literally to fill up their time so that they don't do anything else with it. And that's scary to me. This is one of the markers that you look for when you're looking for a cult. And I've been paying attention to Stefan Molyneux this week, basically in the context of his being a cult leader. And I don't want to say that he is or isn't. I really don't care. I really don't care. It is clear to me that Molyneux's continued harping on the idea of disassociating yourself with your family is horribly, horribly anegoic, horribly self-destructive. And that puts him into a category that makes it easy for me to deal with him, in the sense that if he's anegoic, if he's anti-egoistic, I don't bother with him. He's of no interest to me whatever. He's of a piece with the rest of philosophy for all of human history. He is also focused on the dump. He's looking for some cause outside of himself for his misery, and he's gonna, in this case, he's blaming it on his family, but it doesn't matter who he blames it on, because there's only one author of your actions, there's only one author of your life. There's only one self you can improve. There's only one splendor you can achieve, your own. And only one squalor you can achieve, your own. And where I really have trouble with this idea of defooing is that it is taking people who are very much interested in maximizing their lives and by a very simple, subtle means convincing them to destroy their lives instead. Whatever it is they think they're getting as an immediate benefit from this defooing, what they are giving up is enormous. And a trade of values where you give up something huge and get nothing in exchange, yeah, that's a fraud. That's a terrible, terrible thing. I object to this idea as an instance, really a vicious instance of anegoism, of anti-egoism. It is hugely disproportionate that if you have a parent who is sexually abusing you or has sexually abused you in the past, this is a relationship that is worth breaking. Verbally abused you in a vicious way, is incapable of engaging with you in a sane, civilized manner. These are all good reasons for breaking with an individual, a particular person. Defooing in the Molyneuxian zeitgeist consists of destroying every relationship you've had until then. Your relationship with your father, your mother, your brothers and sisters, all of your family friends, all of your personal friends for your whole life. It consists of self-isolation, a complete, and in your formulation, in your claim, a permanent disassociation with everyone that you've ever known. This is voluntary solitary confinement. Voluntarily initiated solitary confinement. This is hideously stupid. I mean, really stupid. Solitary confinement drives people crazy. Being alone all the time drives people crazy. We are social animals. We are meant to interact with one another. If we don't, bad things happen. It's not a good thing. It would be a bad thing if it happened accidentally. You were shipwrecked and ended up like, what was it, the movie Stranded, all alone on a desert island for years on end. This will make you nuts. It would be a tragic thing if it were to happen by accident, but for that to happen, for you to do that intentionally, that is twice tragic, and for someone to encourage you to do that, that's evil. That's evil. And I am very distressed. I don't get the impression that it happens with a lot of people. Certainly if you look for incidents reported in the news, they're very few in number. There are websites devoted to the cultishness of Molyneux, and they document a few more cases. But if you go to Freedom Radio's forum, member forum, you find lots and lots and lots of posts from people who are miserable because they've destroyed every relationship they've ever had in their families, and obviously they can't replace them. They can't replace those relationships because the reason that they broke them in the first place is the reason that they'll end up breaking every other relationship they ever formed in their lives. But even worse than that, storgic relationships endure. Storgic relationships are not fragile. They're not breakable. And every other kind of relationship is. Every other kind of relationship is inherently temporary, where a storgic relationship asserts by plan and intention at least that it is permanent, that it is not temporary, that it will only be separated by the death of one of the members of that organization, of that polity, of that polis, of that community. So these kids destroy the relationships they have with the people who will love them despite everything in behalf of people who will throw them away, dispense with them entirely at the first sign of a disagreement. That you have yelled and screamed at your parents, you have said the most vicious things to them, you have more than once said, "I hate you!" And they still love you. They still put up with you. They still pay for you. And they still want to know how you're getting on. And they always want to hear from you. They always want to see you. With your dog. That's the love of a dog. The storgic love that your parents have for you is exactly like the love your dog has for you. You really have to beat a dog to chase it away. And you have beat on your parents something fierce over the years, and you've never managed to chase them away. That if you have grievances with them, you remember them all and treasure them all like your own pet collection of scabs. Your parents have a lot more grievances with you, and they don't remember any one of them. They don't care. That's storgic love. They have it for you, and you don't have it for them. That's why you can even consider throwing them away, is because you don't feel about them the way they feel about you. But the funniest thing about all of this is that it's almost certainly futile. The process of destroying all these relationships is arduous. It's going to take a lot of effort. Destroying one relationship takes a lot of effort. Destroying a dozen is going to take an enormous amount of effort. And in the long run, it's almost certainly futile. You're attempting to whitewash your past, or pretend that your past didn't happen, or that events that happened in your past you're going to pretend didn't happen, you're going to forget about, and you're going to paint over them. You're attempting to pre-paint your future. You're attempting to establish how your future is going to play out by delimiting the number of people who are going to be involved in it, the particular people who are going to be involved in it. But someday you're going to wake up in a hospital. It can happen. You're going to wake up in a hospital, and beside your bed is going to be your mom and your dad that you defooed 12 years ago. And they've never lost sight of you. You've never left their thoughts. They've never stopped worrying and wondering about you. You got an accident. The police called them. The only people that the police could call, because you don't have any other relationships. So the police called your parents, and there they are, beside your bed when you wake up in the hospital. When you think about the relationship that you have with your spouse, here's a good way to think about it, to find out if your spouse feels a storgic love for you. Put yourself in the position of the disgraced TV evangelist, or the disgraced politician, or whatever, that it is suddenly exposed that you are the supreme hypocrite of the universe, and that your whole world is built on sand, and you were arrested, perp walked, thrown into a purple jumpsuit, and jailed. And now you know who your friends are. For the first time in your life, you know who your friends are. And so my question for you is, where is your spouse? Where is your spouse? Is she there with you at the jail? Is she sitting across from you so that you can talk to her through the plexiglass over your little telephones? Or has she left you? Has she renounced you? Has she defooed you? The people who matter to you in your life are not the ones who agree with you on every little particular. That's not necessary, and it's not possible. There is no one who agrees with you on every little particular. If people disagree with you in such a way that they actually present a peril to your life, physical peril, sexual abuse, ongoing verbal abuse that you can only survive by escaping it. You have to get away. If they're that toxic, then you have to break the relationship. But if they're not, you don't need that kind of perfectly correspondent agreement. What you need is someone who's going to stand by you when everyone else has turned on you. The family that matters to you is not some family of your choosing. The family that matters to you is the people who would never defoo you, the people who would never betray you, the people who would never cut you up. And to squander those relationships is unbelievably foolish, just foolish. It's futile. It almost certainly will not work. It's obviously viciously anagogic. It is disproportionate to the conflict that you may have with these people. It is hugely disproportionate, and therefore it is irrational. But simply as a matter of practical ontology, carrying the proposition back to the argument, it won't work. It will not work. You will not be able to sustain it without continuous, ongoing, arduous effort, which you will not undertake. You won't do it. Ultimately, as an argument for libertarianism or for anarcho-capitalism or whatever it is that Molyneux says he stands for, it's foolish that way too, because the family is the building block of the civilization. That to the extent that Molyneux is anti-family, Molyneux is anti-liberty. And when somebody makes a truly basic error like that, I wonder why. I wonder what it is that led to such an amazingly stupid error. Because, again, carry it back to the object. We only find liberty where we find fatherhood, where we find serious, dedicated, systematic, philosophical fatherhood, where we find fathers who are absolutely certain of what it is that their job is, and they are doing it 100%. And anything that disrupts that destroys the prospect, not just for human liberty, but for civil society as such. That a world without families is a world without values, a world without thriving, without flourishing, ultimately without anything. That to be anti-family is to be nihilistic in the most fundamental way. No family is perfect, and that it's understood that every fishbowl is different, none of them are wrong, and practically speaking, none of them are perfectly right. But almost all of them are perfectly adequate. And to imply in any way at all that there's something defective about something that works, the only thing that works for providing for human thriving, that's certainly the thing that works best for providing human thriving, to insist that there's some defect in that requires its wholesale destruction is not just anti-egoistic, not just anti-libertarian, it's ultimately anti-human. And this really is my rejection of Swann Molyneux, to the extent that he wants to destroy families, he wants to destroy human lives, and I guess that makes him my enemy. I think it means he wants to kill me. I better defoo him right away. In reality, if I thought I wanted to kill him, this is one of his idiot arguments, is that your parents and other people that you know, because they're muddle-headed about statism, taxation, regulation, etc., because they're muddle-headed, they want to kill you, and therefore you should sever your relationships with them immediately because they want to kill you. But this is retarded. If they actually want to kill you, you should kill them immediately. Kill you before you kill me. I would argue that Swann Molyneux's philosophy, if consistently applied, follow that vector as long as necessary, we arrive at a point where Swann Molyneux and I are in a state of civil war. He wants to kill me, and in self-defense, I'm going to find it necessary to kill him. That is not the circumstance now. Not even close to it. And therefore, to draw any sort of conclusion or to take any sort of an action on the basis of Swann Molyneux's anti-egoic, anti-libertarian, anti-humanism to set about to assassinate Swann before he assassinates me is disproportionate. It is irrational. I don't intend to spend any time investigating the other irrationalities that I might find in Molyneux's philosophy, but it is plausible to argue that that kind of disproportion is going to show up everywhere. It's certainly the case that rationalism, the belief in the prescriptive power of deductive reasoning, that a faultless chain of deductive propositions is dispositive from reality, that the map creates the territory, all of that is hugely erroneous and ultimately not worth bothering with either. But the thing that makes it worthwhile to me to even consider the existence of Swann is this argument that there is some value or benefit in destroying long-term storgic relationships. There is not. Except where the relationship is truly toxic. To destroy a relationship on a whim is hugely self-destructive. One relationship, and to destroy all of your relationships on a whim is massively self-destructive. It will be hugely painful to you and to all the people that you've cut off, and there is no benefit whatever to doing this. There is no gain whatever to be realized from doing this. To the contrary, it's nothing but a loss. If you've been involved in this, if you've done this, either defooing by the way of Swann Molyneux or under the influence of some other cult or cult-like influence, have cut off all your relationships with your family, I'd love to hear from you. Just drop me a note. I would love to talk to you about this, to hear about your experience, to hear how it's worked out for you. As with abortion, I expect that I will never hear from anyone who says, wow, this was the best decision I ever made, cutting off everyone I ever knew. I mean, 2.5 years of loneliness and then nobody to associate with except self-isolated gnomes just like me, all of whom are bending over backwards to say nothing controversial to avoid being shunned by all the others. There's nobody going to send a letter like that. I hope your stories aren't too unhappy, but I'd be interested to hear what you have to say, and frankly, I'd be interested in helping you fix those relationships, because that's what you should have done. If you realized that you had a problem, what you should have done is fix those relationships, not destroy them. Everything can be fixed. Everything can be repaired. If you're not dead, it's not over. But everything we know of love, we learn by being loved. And everything about us that makes us lovable was cultivated and nurtured in us by our parents, by their love. Whatever mistakes they might have made, they did the job. And you can tell because you're here talking to me about it now. They love you more than anyone in the world, perhaps excepting your spouse and your children. And they deserve better than they've gotten from you. So that's me for Sunday. I wish I were in a happier frame of mind. I'm not. I'm feeling pretty happy on the inside, but this particular topic has me kind of in a state of top-level turmoil upstairs in the thinking brain. So. Don't know that I have too much in the way of a marshmallow coating this weekend, but I am very grateful to you for giving me your time, and I'm interested in hearing about the experience that people have with the defoo-universe in general. I'm gonna go. Bless you. Thank you so much. Have a great week. I'll talk to you next Sunday.